Hey everyone, this is Adriano Peta from the World Geopolitics channel, and in today's video, we are going to take a closer look at how this transformation of elites is happening in the United States, because we've already seen a video here showing that a change of elites is happening over in England. This has also happened in Europe, though I haven't made a video on it and don't plan to. Today, we'll focus on the United States since it impacts the world. But we're in Brazil, it affects the world. Actually, what we're seeing is a very rapid change of elites all over the world. All the countries in the world will go through changes in the coming decades. Some will resist, others will change to who knows what. And the United States is in that phase of changing to I don't know what. That doesn't mean they're in collapse. I don't see the United States in collapse like a lot of people say. I see them going through a structural change of power, just like when Rome was a monarchy and became a republic, and then from a republic to an empire. That's what I'm seeing now in the United States, a structural change of power and this replacement of elites, but not its collapse. But we'll look at this in more detail in today's video. But before that, guys, don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and share it. Share this channel a lot, because if we depend on YouTube, no one will even know it exists. It's completely swept under the rug by YouTube, so your help by sharing it a lot is really important. If each person who watches, if you watch this video and share it with 5 or 10 people, wow, that would already be something phenomenal. You have no idea how much you help the channel when you share it, especially in WhatsApp groups, on Facebook, on Telegram. With your boss, with your girlfriend, with your boyfriend, with your dad, it helps a lot, so share it. Okay, guys? And if you're just arriving here now and you're not subscribed, subscribe too, but don't just subscribe. Always take a look at what's coming out. Every Thursday at 7 p.m. there's a new video. Alright? My name is Adriano Peta, and this is the channel Geopolitics, World Geopolitics. Between 1932 and 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, a new anti-capitalist and anti-socialist ideology began to take center stage in public debate in the United States. The so-called technocratic movement, which advocated technocracy as a system of government instead of representative democracy and party politics, proposing to replace politicians, party members, and businessmen with scientists and engineers who had enough knowledge and technical skill to manage the economy and other parts of the government. In the end, technocracy ended up losing ground to other proposals, such as how to deal with the Great Depression crisis. But the idea itself continued to exist, even if only among a few people. It spread among influential people over the decades, but it never had much relevance. It was never taken seriously enough to become a real political movement. The idea behind this movement is actually quite appealing. After all, when you look at these generic, not very intelligent, egocentric, corrupt politicians, empty of morality, who seem almost semi-human, with no strategic vision for the state, and who keep coming up with bills like their cooking recipes, just to make it look like they're working or that they're capable of thinking, it becomes easy to understand that maybe it would actually be better if we were governed by specialized and intelligent people. However, even so, with all these flaws, these politicians have an enormous ability to survive. And after all, who were these nerd technocrats in the middle of a forest full of experienced foxes, crocodiles, and lions? Like those traditional politicians involved in all kinds of schemes and political conspiracies? It's not like you could really take this idea of technocracy seriously, right? Apparently, and even though it seems like I'm talking about Brazil, I'm actually talking about the United States. But it's important to understand the context in which this movement emerged, because the early 1930s was a period of intense competition between ideologies. And disillusioned Americans were exposed to socialism, fascism, liberalism, and a whole range of other ideologies. Different models of economic planning, state intervention, and even early versions of what would later become the New Deal. But there, for a short period of time, technocracy managed to surpass all those movements. In terms of popular enthusiasm and immediate appeal, it presented itself as something new, rational, non-ideological, promising efficiency, stability, and prosperity through science and social engineering. No one had taken them seriously, at least until recently, when a genuinely technocratic government, which many people mistakenly believe to be socialist, began to take the lead in global economic and industrial matters. China, yes, the Communist Party of China is only communist in name, and thinking they're socialists or communists just because they call themselves that is ignoring reality. It's like thinking that if you put milk in a beer bottle labeled beer, that milk will become beer. The current CCP is no longer Maoist or ideological in the classic sense. It is technocratic, meritocratic, internally obsessed with stability, data-driven, pragmatic, and hostile to political volatility. And above all, they rely on technological development to underpin the future of Chinese civilization. These are characteristics of the American technocratic movement. China's success factor emerged at the same time that democracy in the United States began to crumble due to political polarization. And, contrary to what many people think, it wasn't the outsourcing of American jobs to China that caused this. No, the United States was already stumbling and becoming disoriented long before China's success factor came into play. However, the United States did not collapse and break the system like what happened with the Soviet Union or other countries. Because it is an extremely agile and adaptable culture, the result of a dynamic individualism that values freedom and innovation, as well as distrust in a central federal government. So, this creates an internal conflict that prevents elites from easily taking over the whole country to do whatever they want, as would happen in other countries. And it's also the result of very strong state power that's resistant to the influence of the federal capital, Washington. So, this dynamism, which you could even say is somewhat chaotic at a certain level, combined with this political decentralization, it gave Americans an important lifeline in the face of very powerful forces that have always tried to monopolize power in an absolute way. Many other societies around the world would have already succumbed to these forces, but this American complexity has made absolute control difficult, at least until now. Because, of course, everything has its time. The moral fatigue of American society from a system that was incompatible with its traditional values had been present since the 1970s with the aftermath of the Vietnam War. One thing, after all, was fighting in World War II, a war where they were attacked first. And it was defensive both on their part and on the part of allied countries. Another thing was them being the aggressors in a war with no end in sight. That had a huge psychological effect. And the other big crisis, the drug crisis, already existed in the 80s and 90s, causing real gang wars in the main North American cities. However, all of this was still something that American society managed to deal with, albeit with difficulty, but they were able to move forward until September 11 happened. And here, the impacts of a psychological, technological, economic, and political context came together. Psychologically, there was the trauma of terrorism and the distrust of infiltration in the country. Washington took advantage of this to create legislation that would allow them greater internal surveillance. This coincided with a technological moment that allowed a series of new technologies to be implemented in this surveillance. And economically, because that's when the rise of China began, and China was a challenge in political science and in the economy. Because the absolute faith that most scientists, politicians, and economists had was basically twofold, with each one reaffirming the other, but through opposite paths. Because in the first idea, it was the idea that a nation that develops becomes wealthy and reaches a high level of education and per capita wealth. Inevitably, it would generate a more inclusive, questioning, and politically participative middle class, which would push for changes in the political system. There would be no other option then but to open up politically and democratize in the style of Western liberal democracy. The second idea was that a nation could only continue to grow richer and become economically and technologically competitive if it adopted a free economic system. And there's no way for the economy to be free without politics also being free and democratic. In both cases, nothing that was China, but a few theorists noticed something that economists, scientists, and politicians couldn't see. And it's no wonder, because these two fields, while focused on their specialties and bubbles, wouldn't be able to see the broader context and the depth that involves geopolitics and civilizations. Unlike what most people said that China would become westernized, a few said that the world would actually become more Chinese, in the sense of copying China more. And if you're thinking that this would be a Chinese communist plan to make the world more Chinese so that they could dominate a controlled world, so by Beijing, that's why it would be more cynicized. I'm sorry, but this video won't please you. Because it would be much easier if that were the answer, because it's a simple and dumb answer, but that's not what happens. What happens is due to a purely anthropological factor that, for thousands of years, has influenced geopolitics. Being a force much, much stronger than any secret conspiracy, which is the power of example. And that's not by chance. If you follow the channel, you know that humans copy what they see as examples of success, whether as individuals, as groups, or as nations. There are some videos where I explain this, the anthropological reason behind this issue of copying examples of success. But the point is that, while the United States stood out as an extreme success after the end of the Soviet Union, the liberal democracy model became the model considered the best executed, the one that could lead nations to success. Many people think it's just because of an American imposition, but that's only half true, because at the same time that there was, yes, this movement of imposition by the United States, there was also an internal movement within the nations where many people wanted to copy this American political and economic model because it seemed to be the most successful one. Understand that in geopolitics we're never talking about just one thing, but always about a combination of things that generate others. Because there was this messianic drive from the United States to spread liberal democracy, even if it had to be by force. But there were also, within the countries, movements wanting to copy the Americans. But as I said, it gradually also began to show signs of fatigue. Soon the rise of China repeats this same process. Today it appears to be the most successful model, and I say it appears. This game isn't over yet. We'll need to wait another 30 years before making a final decision. But this Chinese model, politically more closed, semi-democratic, because even though it's a dictatorship, it's not a personalist dictatorship like the nationalist Arab dictatorships of Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein. Or, as was the case with the Chilean dictatorship under Pinochet, this dictatorship is more institutionalized, but it's also not as harsh and impenetrable as it is in North Korea or in China itself during the Maoist era. It has access points, but these access points are much more filtered than they would be in a democracy. However, it is not really a democracy. It's something politically closed, but it's extensive and comprehensive, and in terms of the economy, it's not quite a liberal capitalist system. But it's already more liberal than most European countries, or even more than Brazil itself, for example, but above all, the Communist Party of China. It is managed by a technical elite, people specialized in their fields of expertise, and mainly, predominantly, by engineers. Among those who said that the world would become more Chinese, there are two who deserve attention, the academic Stephen Halper and the journalist Martin Jacques Halper. He says that China's competitive advantage in the developing world is not only economic, but also political and institutional, and that it operates simultaneously on three levels: speed and economic flexibility, conversion of trade into diplomatic support, and the spread of an alternative model to Western liberal democracy. For several countries, the Chinese approach is faster, less bureaucratic, and less paternalistic than the Western one. Unlike the Europeans, who want to act like parents to developing or underdeveloped countries, as if they know what's best for them, and then they want to give moral lessons. China focuses only on negotiating with whoever is signing the paycheck, while projects with the World Bank can take years of negotiation and impose moralistic conditions. Deals with China are closed in months, without demands for political or institutional reforms, and this agility comes from Chinese capitalism. State subsidies, allowing Chinese companies to take on projects that are not very profitable in the short term to secure strategic objectives, access to commodities, and political influence. As if without the restraints of liberal democracies, such as strong parliaments with vested interests or public pressure, China can negotiate and execute agreements much faster than the United States, Europe, and Japan, and these trade relations turn into diplomatic support. Without imposing, as I said, Beijing doesn't impose conditions, but it ends up extracting consistent support on issues that benefit it, such as the Tibet or Taiwan issue. On the economic institutional level, China is the most visible example of a broader trend that includes Russia, Gulf countries, and Asia, where large companies, like national champions, have become instruments of foreign policy. This model directly challenges the Western idea that free markets naturally lead to liberalization and politics. The Reagan-Thatcher era, based on privatization, deregulation, and a strong link between capitalism and democracy, is being replaced by a logic in which states use the market to reinforce internal political control and external projection, something learned from China. The most powerful element of the Chinese example is this equation: politics, economic growth, plus social order and stability. For many elites in the global south, the promise is clear: prosperity and stability without religious elections. The Chinese model is a model of hybrid capitalism in which the state remains omnipresent as a strategist, financier, regulator, owner, and coordinator. Instead of randomly privatizing everything, China has consolidated large, competitive, state-owned enterprises in strategic areas, exposed to both domestic and international competition, but capable of attracting private capital and operating globally. At the same time, strategic Chinese private companies receive direct political support. The result is an ecosystem in which the boundaries between public and private are deliberately ambiguous but functionally effective. In other words, China's success does not result from adopting Western liberalism, but from its selective rejection. The state did not disappear, it became more sophisticated, more flexible, and more strategic. And after the image of collapse of the Anglo-American model with the 2008 financial crisis, this arrangement gained even more global appeal, especially in the developing world. Jacques says that, while the European powers and later the United States built their global projection, based on expansionist, colonial, and universalist impulses linked to constant wars, political and ideological messianism, and the idea of a civilizing mission, the Chinese trajectory is very different. They are literally like whatever. This doesn't mean that China will escape the general logic of power, but that its rise will combine elements common to any superpower with different traits from its own history and culture. The Chinese logic, then, combines two things. On one hand, the fact that rising powers tend to expand their interests, their sense of entitlement, and their willingness to impose their preferences, which suggests that China may act similarly to other superpowers. But on the other hand, there is the weight of this Chinese particularism, which shapes its own way of seeing the world, power, and international hierarchy. And these two vectors are not mutually exclusive, they combine. While Europeans and Americans developed a maritime and global vocation, China has always been a continental land-based power. And for the consolidation of its immediate space, even today, China does not have a tradition of overseas military projection comparable to that of the West. Of course, this doesn't mean that it won't change, but it indicates that this behavior is not part of its historical pattern. In addition, the experience of the century of humiliation, the 19th century serves less as a stimulus for revenge, but more as a psychological and strategic restraint, encouraging caution, patience, and an aversion to open military adventures. China represents a post-colonial, Confucian, and developmentalist model that challenges the idea of inevitable convergence to the historical pattern. And this will have a direct impact on the global debate about values. The axis of conflict will no longer be ideological, as it was during the Cold War, and will become civilizational and cultural. Moreover, Confucianism introduces a different ethical standard based on duties, hierarchy, collectivity, and moral example. And this is where we reach the plot twist at the end of this story. Because the great supreme irony is, do you remember that American technocratic movement from 1900 that I mentioned at the beginning of the video? The one that wanted to replace politicians with engineers and seemed to have died out. Well, the idea behind that movement didn't die. It just lay dormant among a very small elite waiting for the right tool. And today, who is resurrecting this way of thinking in the United States? It's not protesters in the streets or the old American political elite that controlled the country for decades, but rather the average American citizen. And these new elites from Silicon Valley and Washington who want to remove the old elite, and who look at China with a certain envy because they understand that the Chinese model is the successful model to be copied, or at least adapted. When this new American elite and this disillusioned middle class, disappointed with the failures of democracy co-opted by the radical woke left, look at China. They don't see oppression, they look and see efficiency. They see a government that decides to build a bridge and builds it in 6 months. Whereas in California it would take 10 years because of bureaucracy, environmental lawsuits, and political disputes. And that's when, On top of that, they wouldn't have to reserve a portion of those jobs to please a political group, whether for racial or gender reasons. And that's important because they see that China is a civilization that protects itself from the influence of foreign groups and protects its ethnic majority. So what we're seeing is probably the beginning of the Chinification of the United States, or the Sinicization of the United States. Americans are copying the Chinese, not completely of course, but at least the essence. Look at the economy. The American government now adopts industrial policy, heavy state subsidies for chips and green energy, choosing which companies will win. Exactly like in China's capitalist model, the future of the United States, ironically, is to become more and more similar. Because to compete with China, the United States is realizing that they will have to copy the Chinese, being forced to become more centralized, more technocratic, and less liberal. After all, the average American citizen, especially the straight white man, found himself being systematically targeted. As the villain of the world and blamed for all the problems in the universe, he was then practically eradicated from public debates. Controlled by the woke movement and Afro-supremacism, the foxes and crocodiles of traditional politics who devoured the technocrats in 1930 are now old and lost. The world has become too complex and very competitive. For that empty rhetoric of the generic politician, the complexity of the 21st century demands technical management and a focus on the long term. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. This change we're seeing is still in progress, it might not be completed, it might evolve into something else. It's very hard to say, there's no crystal ball. What we can say is that right now we have a dispute among the elite. We have a new elite adopting 19th century geopolitical models, fighting against an old elite using what they had. A post-World War II geopolitics much more ideologically oriented than necessarily by a geopolitical interest of the United States. So it's something different that's happening, and something very, how can I say, unpredictable at best. Be cautious of anyone claiming to know what will happen. The truth is, no one is certain except that we're entering a transition. It's like we're in a place with a lot of fog and there's no way to know what's ahead. When you go through this foggy area, who knows what will come next. Anyway, changes will happen, there's no doubt about that. Okay, that's the only certainty right now. As for what changes, it wouldn't be responsible for me or anyone else to say for sure, alright? But I hope you all enjoyed it. Guys, don't forget to share the channel with everyone you know, and if you really like the channel, Geopolitics, and want to make sure it keeps existing, because you never know, it might end. After all, the views on this channel are always very low. The way you can be sure the channel will keep existing is by becoming a member. If you become a member, you guarantee that the channel Geopolitics World will keep existing. In return for that, besides making sure it exists, you'll get early access to videos, you'll get access to exclusive videos. We have the geopolitical history of the United States, the history of the Mongol Empire, the geopolitics of the Mongol Empire, the military history of China. We even have an intelligence course. And of course, there are the live streams where you can interact directly with me and also join the Telegram groups, which are also exclusive for members. It's a full package of benefits, plus it helps keep the channel going, okay? Thank you all, hugs, and see you in the next video.